So hello everyone, my name is Sara VonTersch and welcome to my senior TED Talk. Over the past 3 months I've been extensively researching the question I chose of what is the most effective way to reduce the power and minimize the negative effects of drug cartels. Throughout this presentation, I hope to create an understanding of economic trends in the drug trade, as well as give some insight in individual roles. In early 2008, Ciudad Juarez, the Mexican border town south of El Paso, awoke to a battlefield outside their front door. The city of 1.3 million people was deemed the most dangerous from 2008 to 2012 due to a turf war over ports into the U.S. drug trade between rival cartels. In this map, one dot represents one homicide in 2010 at the peak of their violence. In this year, on average, there are 10 brutal killings each day. The drug trade negatively affects a wide variety of people, and it seems like a black and white issue. However, the cartel responsible for instigating this specific violence was not frowned upon by civilians. In fact, later that year, there was a parade in honor of its leader. It's hard to imagine such support in spite of recent events, but we have to remember that 3.3 million people live off of money generated by drug cartels. On the image on the right, you can see the Medellin cartel in comparison with number of employees to Google, Domino's, and FedEx. It's much larger. A lot of people rely on drug cartels not even for employment, but the civilians that live in the towns that they run. Right off the bat, when I started researching drug cartels, what became very evident to me was the amount of death tolls. To put drug violence into perspective, there were 10 times the amount of casualties in Mexico alone as there were in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars combined. What often happens is these numbers desensitize you, and the narrative turns into criminals are being killed, and that's what happens in the drug trade. This was way too simple for me, and so I didn't stop there. And that's why we're all here today. It's a very complicated situation with a lot of moving parts, and it's a topic that keeps me up at night. So if you know me, that's a good thing. What you can expect to see throughout this presentation is a problem identification, what are the negative effects of cartels and why they occur, current forms of combating cartels, specifically under supply and demand side intervention, and my personal conclusions, where I think policy goals should be headed in, as well as the consumer role that we all play. So first I had to identify what the negative effects of cartels were, and I came up with two broad terms: violence and drug addiction. Violence is a problem in drug cartels because when something is suppressed into a black market, there are no legal means of upholding contracts or employees, therefore they have to resort to violence. This will happen in any underground market. Every cartel is the same in that they resort to violence to uphold contracts and employees. Drug addiction is a little more intuitive. Cartels supply an abundance of illegal narcotics, and this leads to drug addiction and abuse. In order to combat cartels, currently the US and Mexico governments are putting an emphasis on supply-side intervention. Some examples of these would be aerial or manual spraying, which is eradicating the coca leaf from the raw ingredient, raids and border interceptions of drugs, and the goals are to reduce the supply that the consumer countries have in the first place. If they don't get that supply, that will lead to scarcity, which will hypothetically increase the price of drugs and decrease the demand in the consumer countries. In the past 15 years, the U.S. has spent over $10 million on aerial and manual eradication. This is where they go over it with a plane and spray the raw material before it can even be made into cocaine in the first place. Though this has occasionally forced narco farmers out of one area and into another, it has not successfully completed the goal of increasing the price and decreasing the demand of drug cartels. In a study conducted by George Gallego and Daniel Rico on cocoa leaf eradication, they saw no correlation between the cocoa price increase that the drug cartels paid and the eradication. The graph on your guys' left is the manual eradication in the y-axis and the price of cocaine in the left. There was no trend line in correlation, same with on the right. That one is for aerial spraying using planes. There was even more eradication, but the price did not significantly show a correlation as increasing. So why is this happening? A lot of the places that they eradicated, up to 15% of the product was eradicated, and in any commodity such as bananas or coffee, this would be a huge blow to the market, but it's not for drugs, which is a little confusing. But I think Walmart can help us figure out what's going on here. So if you meander into your local Walmart, you'll likely come across this monstrosity of a 1-gallon jar of pickles. That's around a year's supply for just under $3. That's pretty unsettling to me, but it shows how Walmart is able to keep low prices all year round. And this is through a monopsony. So a lot of people are familiar with the term of a monopoly, where there is a single seller of a product or good. This leaves the seller to dictate prices. In a monopsony, the market situation is different, where there is a single buyer of a product or good. Walmart is such a big vendor that in order to get your product out there, chances are you're going to have to put it on the Walmart shelves. Due to this, Walmart is able to dictate the prices, and manufacturers are left to deal with whatever Walmart says. The same thing is happening in the drug trade. The narco farmers that are being affected by eradication are not the people, the cartels that are moving the product. Because of the monopsony that cartels hold over these narco farmers. And the narco farmers end up taking most of the blow. So another thing, another supply side intervention that is happening is interceptions and raids. Well, it seems like a logical idea, cutting off the trade before it even gets to consumer countries, but if we actually look at the cocaine supply chain, the perspective might be different. So it starts here in Colombia, where to make 1 kilogram of cocaine, you need 350 kilograms of the raw cocaine ingredient. We know from the Galileo and Rico study that this will run for about $385. So the cartels will buy it for $385, make it into cocaine, and they can sell it back in bulk for $800 in Colombia. Or it can work its way up the chain, and close to the border, it'll be worth $2,200. This is already a remarkable markup in price, but it skyrockets even further once you pass the border. Right across the border, it can be sold in bulk for $14,500. It can continue up the chain, being sold to different levels of street dealers for $19,500, and then eventually sold in smaller quantities for $78,000. So this is the pure price of cocaine after it has made it up its market. If you allow room for cutting and dilution that happens along the chain, the grand total is $1,222. That is a 30,000% markup, which is incredible for any product, any commodity. So yeah, when interventions and raids happen here in the chain before the product even gains value. So cartels don't take as much of a hit with supply-side intervention due to where the value is gained through the drugs later on in the process. The worst part about this is consumer countries don't see it that way. A recent raid in Tijuana in 2015 reported 134 tons of marijuana being obtained. And to do the math to calculate the worth, the police reports multiplied it by 5 and 3 for the amount per gram in Mexico or the United States. This equates to $300 million or $500 million, and that's a big worth. The UN saw this as a remarkable achievement. It was written off in a lot of the local newspapers. But in reality, what would have happened to that in the warehouse in Tijuana, that 134 tons would be sold in Mexico in bulk for only 8 cents a gram. This would equate to $10 million, which seems like still a lot, but that's only less than 3% what the police report initially said it. Wealthy countries are able to sleep with numbers of success, even though what's actually happening is the cartels are still able to maintain successful routes into the U.S. drug market. So supply-side intervention tactics have not successfully increased the price of drugs in consumer countries, but let's say that it did. Another economic principle would come into if the price of drugs were to fluctuate, and that's elasticity. If a product is elastic, it means the demand will fluctuate along with the price. In this situation, the man will buy the Coca-Cola at $1, but at $3 he won't. his demand for the product fluctuated with the price. But for an inelastic demand, the price will not cause the demand to fluctuate. So for the milk, when it's 80 cents, she's going to buy it, but even when the milk rises to $2.40, she's still going to buy the milk because it is a necessity for her. Drugs are inelastic. Marijuana has an elasticity of 0.33, which means that a 10% increase in price would only lead to a 3.3% drop in demand. Cocaine and heroin have even smaller elasticities of 0.17 and 0.09, meaning a 10% increase in price would only lead to a 1.7% drop in demand and a 0.9% drop in demand. So even if supply-side tactics were to be successful in increasing the price of drugs, it would not significantly decrease the demand, which is the end goal in supply-side tactics in the first place, and that seems pretty futile. So this leads me to my conclusions. The supply-side strategies that are being implemented today that emphasize supply-side tactics allocate a large amount of money and resources towards with little to no showing of success. Cartels still maintain a huge amount of power, and their negative effects are evident all throughout the chain. This map shows color coordinations of what cartels operate in which parts of the state, which indicates corruption and therefore somewhat control. The map is pretty colored in, which is pretty scary, but there is hope, and that leads me to demand-side intervention. So the money is there. People are spending a lot on the drug trade and the drug war. We just need to redirect it to a more effective use. So the focus on demand-side intervention is not on the cartels themselves, but on the consumers that feed into the market. Prohibition is the lawful ban of having or using a dangerous substance. And in 1998, the UN had an assembly on the drug control problem. A drug-free world, we can do it. This was their motto. It's ironic that they even consider it drug control, considering the cartels run the supply chain, and the UN has this idea that there is a world out there without drugs. I guess we just haven't found it yet. Prohibition criminalizes drugs, but for cases like marijuana, the case for legalization has been made, that there are more deadly or equally deadly substances out there in order for adults to consume. Now in places like Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, the government has control over a regulated drug market, the pot industry. Harder drugs have a different argument for the switch from prohibition to control. These drugs are, or at least can be, dangerous, and therefore they should not be suppressed to an underground market where they are unregulated and run by criminals. The deception that prohibition takes us from the responsibility of choosing to take drugs or not is depleted by the fact that drugs are there whether we want them or not, whether they are legal or not. As individuals in the society, we need to take responsibility of choice and decide what role drugs are going to play in our adult lives, with or without drug laws. And I know that the thought of decriminalized hard drugs is a controversial one, but it has and it can work. Switzerland has a really good model to show how this can be effective. In the early 90s, Switzerland put in a program that targeted 30,000 of their hardcore drug users that only equated to 13% of the heroin-using population, but consumed 60% of the entire country's consumption rate. So they were very hardcore users, and Switzerland decriminalized heroin in order to substitute them and get them to the heroin addicts in a safer place. This map shows the success of this program. You can see in the early 90s when it was implemented, the rate of deaths in orange and the rate of AIDS due to drug deaths is in the black, slowly started to decline. By 2005, 70% of all heroin users were on some sort of substitution heroin therapy or treatment, which is the highest ratio in the world. The last thing I would like to convey to you guys today is that wealthy countries need to do a better job at educating their drug-buying youth as to where their money is going. Chances are that taking an illegal drug for the first time, like cocaine, it won't kill you, but it very well may kill someone else. 93% of the cocaine coming into the United States has been through Mexican cartels' hands. This leads to the unsettling fact that by funding this, you are putting money toward the unimaginable suffering borders away. We need to take responsibility as a consumer country and help put this to an end. The most effective way to reduce the power of drugs and minimize their effects is by focusing on the economic forces and demand-side intervention instead of the supply-side war on drugs. It's time to change the narrative. It's time to end the war on drugs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. We're now going to move into questions.
I forgot.
Yeah, stay up there. You don't get to leave yet. So audience members, please feel free if you guys have questions, raise your hand. Sarah will call on you, and panelists obviously as well.
Lori.
So you mentioned early on that the civilians are largely in support of the drug cartels in Mexico. But like they have this huge, they have parades for them. Like,
Yeah.
what is going on there? Because it seems like a contradiction that there's so much violence in these communities caused by the cartels, and yet the communities are in support of them.
Yeah, it's a really hard topic, and especially so from their perspective, a lot of the money that they have is generated from cartels. But what I think is even more influential is the PR, public relations, that the cartels put out. So a lot of cartels, like even a lot of you know El Chapo, pretty famous kingpin, he was a big philanthropist. He built like huge amusement parks and stuff for people in Mexico. They make themselves seem like they want to be a part of like the global responsibility, and they put there's one thing called an institutional void, which is where like a lack of infrastructure or anything that the institution needs that the government is not filling. And oftentimes cartels will get there first and create some sort of a connection with their civilians, because the more people they have backing them, the harder it is to take them down. So they create almost an empire using their corporate global responsibility and the acts of philanthropy. They like do their best to create a relationship with civilians so that they don't see it as much as a negative market. They see it as like their market and the people that are vouching for them even more than their government is.
What exactly made you choose this topic?
Well, in Kyle's class, we worked on an economic unit that was like really big and really hard to understand, and I had fun navigating it, and so I was like thinking of other economic things that they navigate, and drug cartels do it like with heels and backwards because they're it's an illegal entity. So I just found it interesting in the first place. I started looking into it. I found out how actually genius they are, and it's more than just a lot of death and drugs, and I became more interested with everything I read, and I became really passionate about it after researching it a lot. So.
So what are like some concrete policies that we would need to put in place in this country to effectively address this supply side issue?
Okay, yeah, so there are definitely a lot of concrete policies. I never researched actual policy options, but like the goals and directions that policies should be going towards. And a lot of the demand side intervention is the prison system needs to be a lot better. We need to be rehabilitating a lot more than we need to be locking people up. So the prison system is a good place to start. I believe that decriminalizing harder drugs and putting more money towards rehabilitation is like really going to be the number one thing to do there. I think I'm going to leave my answer at that.
So with the rehabilitation, I know that we've kind of tried that in the United States with like this synthetic drug that you get from a clinic.
Yeah.
And then, but people will just use that to stay like not sick until their next fix.
Yeah.
So what do you find like to combat that?
So the policies, especially in the drug control problem, is a huge give and take. By decriminalizing drugs, you are leaving more space open for a lot of those type of things to happen, and people are getting away easier on drugs. The prisons are cushier from nonviolent drug offenses. That is bound to happen. my whole goal was to find out what the best way to increase the well-being of the people around the drug trade is, and that's just what I found. But I realized that there is going to be a give and take, and combating it, I think, is going to be like another step. Yeah. How?
So you talk about decriminalizing, and we have decriminalization happening in the marijuana industry in the United States, in all drugs in other countries, Portugal, so on. Did you find any evidence about what the effect decriminalization has on usage?
On usage, for the Colorado market, what I read was mostly that it didn't affect the usage. There's a spike at the beginning, but then it tends to level out as time goes on. I mean, you see a lot of new users, especially when the drug becomes legal in the first place, people that the law was the only thing holding them back from doing it, and then you see it does level out. What I think is prohibition is almost redundant, because like the reason I don't do heroin is not because it's illegal, it's because I wouldn't do heroin, and I think that usually stays the same, and I don't think that the drug laws are, especially for harder drugs, I don't think that they're protecting anyone that wouldn't be doing the drug in the first place.
Did you see evidence to support that logic?
I probably did, but I do not remember at this time like what a specific evidence would be.
I mean, out of your 60 articles, you don't have that one fact on hand? Come on, Sarah.
I'm sorry. Any more questions?
It's time for one more, if anybody has one. All right.
Alright, so you brought up like your solution of like not taking the direct approach on the cartels, you know, but what would happen like on the flip side if we did say start targeting like kingpins to take like the whole like cartel down?
Yeah. So that is a common policy option that people do. It's called decapitation of the cartel, where you take down the leader, and it can actually be very dangerous. So what happens is it creates a vacuum, and people are rushing to fill that vacuum. It creates a very dangerous environment, and eventually the person that ends up taking that next role, which it will be filled, you know that, happens to be more deadly than the person that was taken out in the first place. It creates like a succession of violence, and eventually the person coming out on top is willing to go that extra mile to get there. So you see it just making cartels deadlier and deadlier because they're equipped to facing people that are trying to target the kingpins.
All right. On that note, we are going to send Sarah out of the room for a moment.